Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. My name is Ana Sangronis, and I work for the University of Florida IFAS Extension Service here in Miami-Dade County. This webinar series is a joint effort between UF IFAS Extension, Miami EcoAdventures, and Florida Sea Grant. We are bringing you these webinars every second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. So if you are on our mailing list and receiving the topics, wonderful. Or you can follow us on social media, or you can send me an email and I will add you to our mailing list to receive the reminder emails. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later through our YouTube channel. Tonight, we will be learning all about the Gopher Tortoise, and that will be presented by my friend and colleague, Ed Pritchard from Miami EcoAdventures. Take it away, Ed.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. And thank you guys all for coming tonight and tuning in for our series tonight and for our presentation on the Gopher Tortoise. So as Anna said, my name is Ed Pritchard. I'm a co-host of this webinar series, and I'm currently an interpretive program supervisor with the Miami-Dade County Parks Miami EcoAdventures unit. And also I serve as the manager at the Crandon Park Visitor and Biscayne Nature Center out on Key Biscayne. So aside from my work, I was born and raised in South Florida, and I've always had a passion for our region's flora and fauna, and of course our unique landscapes and seascapes. Specifically where I grew up in Jupiter, it's an important nesting ground for sea turtles, and I've been active the last 10 years as a permitted individual to assist with surveys and conservation. But there was one species that wasn't a sea turtle that I would come across more frequently in my yard or on hikes. And that's always one that I was endeared to, and that's the subject of tonight's talk, the Gopher Tortoise. So just a quick little overview of this species and what we're going to go over tonight. So we're going to talk about taxonomy and appearance, distribution and habitat. We'll then go into diet and behavior. We'll talk about their home, their burrows, and then we'll talk about nesting. We'll look at some cool hatchling photos of them. Then we'll look at some threats and conservation work. And then we'll go through some ways that you can help this species and help protect these animals, these charismatic creatures. So before we jump into the presentation, I'd like to first have you guys take a quick poll. We're going to go over these things in the presentation, but we want to kind of get a good knowledge gain out of this. And so Anna's going to launch that. And if you could just go ahead and answer that as best you can. And then we'll go ahead and take this again at the end of the presentation. And while you guys are doing that, I do encourage you guys, if you have questions during this presentation, you can go ahead and type them in the chat. Anna just, she'll moderate that for me, and we'll have that opportunity at the end to answer questions. So I'll read, we still have a couple more, but I'll read that. What is the average lifespan of a gopher tortoise in the wild is the first question. The second one is a true or false. Is the gopher tortoise federally listed as threatened in its entire range? And then the third is, on average, a gopher tortoise burrow is how many feet in length? All right, how are we looking, Anna?
I think we have a majority, Ed. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll.
Okay, great. Thank you guys for participating in that. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on. So we'll start with just the taxonomy of this specific species, the gopher tortoise. Its scientific name is Gopherus polyphemus. It's in the order Testudines. And so turtles and tortoises are an order of reptiles in that Testudines order. They're characterized by a shell developed mainly from their ribs, so it's not a detached body part. It is, you know, part of their attached to the ribs, part of their main body. So modern turtles are divided into two major groups. So there's these side neck turtles. That's just, again, the characteristics of how they're, you know, how much can they move their neck into their body. So we have those side neck turtles, and then down here, the hidden neck turtles. And that really makes up a good number of the 360 living and recently extinct species of turtles. So that includes the land-dwelling tortoises, such as the gopher tortoise that we're going to talk about tonight. And it also includes things like freshwater terrapins. So those are kind of the breakdown of the taxonomy. Of course, tortoises and turtles are closely related, you know, are closely tied to birds, reptiles, other reptiles, crocodilians, things like that. They, you know, breathe air, they don't lay legs underwater, and, you know, most species do live in or around it. So that's the taxonomy. We're going to just look quickly at some of the differences of tortoises and turtles. So there's a few different characteristics that we usually look for to distinguish. And again, the tortoise is what we would refer to as a, you know, land dwelling. So they're built to, you know, to live with on and to move around on land. So they have those short, sturdy feet, and they have bent legs. So they, you know, they can, you know, move around and have flexibility. They also have a domed heavy shell. So it's more of that dome shape than a flat aerodynamic shape that a turtle. So in this graphic, we have a sea turtle, but that includes, you know, freshwater turtles too. They have more of that aerodynamic or hydrodynamic, I guess would be the appropriate term. And then they have the flipper-like legs and webbed feet on the turtles, the sea turtles, freshwater turtles. Of course, where they live, and then also not pictured here, but, you know, what they eat. So tortoises are, for the most part, herbivorous, and then, you know, with turtles, freshwater turtles are more, sea turtles are more omnivorous. So they'll feed on crustaceans and gastropods, and then also we have species like the green sea turtle that feeds on seagrass. So those are some differences quick differences between tortoises and turtles. So moving down and looking at the family of Testudinae that is found in North America. So we have 5 species that are found, tortoise species found in North America. And the gopher tortoise specifically is the only one found east of the Mississippi. So all these other tortoises you'll see here, we have the Mojave desert tortoise, also known as the Agassiz desert tortoise. We have the Texas tortoise, the Sinaloan desert tortoise, the Bolson tortoise, and the Sonoran desert tortoise. All those, again, you know, they're endemic to areas, more desert areas, more dry areas such as Mexico, you know, Arizona, Colorado, those regions. And again, they're adapted to live in these, you know, dry, arid places. And of course, the gopher tortoise shares some of those characteristics, and we'll talk about, you know, some of those shortly. So let's just do a quick species profile on the gopher tortoise, looking at its size and characteristics. So on average, they're usually 9 to 11 inches when they become fully grown, or when they're adults. They can weigh up to 15 pounds, so they're pretty hefty. And again, built to move around, not fast, but they can, you know, kind of amble through those vegetated environments and work towards, and we'll talk about their burrows, but, you know, they're built to be able to dig and things like that. So that's partially, you know, we're looking at identifying what they look like. These big, stumpy, elephantine hind feet and flattened shovel-like forelimbs, you can see here, are covered in thick scales, and they really are flexible. Their lifespan, they can live 40 to 60 years. So for those that answer that one correctly, they are pretty long-lived species. So same thing with, you know, we talk about sea turtles, and some other reptiles, they do have quite a long lifespan, in the wild. And we'll talk about some of the threats that may impact that lifespan. Specifically, the coloration, the shell of the adult gopher tortoise, it's kind of this tan or dark brown, grayish color. When when they get wet, they kind of have more of a tan color, but they're kind of this off brown or gray color. And then one way to distinguish the sex and the adults is they have this concavity on the lower shell or the plastron, so on beneath them. The mature males will actually exhibit the concave plastron, and the females have more of a flat lower shell. So where exactly would we see the gopher tortoise, its range and distribution? So it's, like I said, it's the only tortoise found east of the Mississippi River. And this kind of just shows you the states, the southeastern states that their range extends into. You can even make out some of the counties there. Its range includes if we're going to generalize that area, it's the coastal plain from southeastern Louisiana east to the southern areas of South Carolina, and then of course down into the Florida Peninsula. And they actually do occur again in all 67 of Florida's counties. So this is, and we'll talk about their habitats, but obviously the Florida Peninsula is made up of quite a few different habitats, all the way from the Panhandle down to South Florida here in Miami-Dade County. So they are adapted to live in these different regions, but this is their range in North America. And then let's also, when we're looking at this map, talk about their protections. So one of the questions in the poll was referring to their federal listing. So they're actually, they are only federally listed in parts of their range. So that includes Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And that's under the Endangered Species Act. So that's shown here in the pink color. And then in Florida, they are designated as species of special concern. So they're not, listed as threatened or endangered. And that's something that we'll talk about in terms of, protections and conservation. And then in terms, at least in the states that they exist in, they all are offered some state protection. So that's good, at least that we have some, state agencies that protect and conserve this species. So here in Florida, the gopher tortoise is listed as a state listed threatened species. So that means that here in Florida, its habitat, so its burrow, and the tortoise itself is protected under state law. Actually, there was a ruling this week. I was, doing some research yesterday, where the federal government commented on, there was a petition to list it as on the federal endangered species list as threatened or endangered. And they came down with a ruling this week. And they said that gopher tortoises are not in danger of extinction. They rejected that request by wildlife agencies and other groups to list this species. And there was a 113-page decision. And they said, basically, we'll continue to recognize it as federally listed in those areas here, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, but not in Florida. So again, this has been an effort. They've been trying to get more protection for these species. So unfortunately, we'll see if there's another petition down the road. But for now, this is the current protections, protected by the state, but not federally listed as threatened or endangered. And of course, the reason that they're requesting these sorts of things is because funding and habitat protections, there's just a lot more things that can be done to help conserve the species when they are part of that endangered species list. So that's kind of the effort being put forth in order to manage these species. So we talked a little bit about, how Florida and some of these other areas that they're found in have a diversity of habitats. So these species, gopher tortoises, prefer well-drained, sandy soils. So some of the habitats that have that include longleaf pine sandhills, pine flatwoods, such as this one here, xeric oak hammocks, scrub habitat. So that's areas that are pretty much like ancient dunes. So areas that are near the coast that do have that sandy soil, pine flatwoods, dry prairies, and then even coastal dunes. So sometimes you'll find them in those back dune areas, not on the beach, but behind them. And a lot of these habitats historically rely on fire, and these habitats, in order to kind of reduce the canopy cover and not progress to a different habitat succession, they rely on that fire, and a lot of plant species also for growth rely on fire. So with development and with Florida and some of these other states, we've really suppressed that fire in these environments, and that can actually become unsuitable for these tortoises. They again rely on for their food, for their diet, and then again these areas that are sandy and open. They're also found in a variety of disturbed habitats, so that includes pastures, urban areas. Again, as long as that predominant soil type is that sandy, dry soil, and they'll move into other areas for like foraging and basking in the sunlight to warm up, and so again they kind of move around. And again, to point out, even though they live in these coastal areas, they cannot swim, so they're not a species that sometimes we find situations where people just bring them to the beach to put them back in the water, and we don't want that. So we'll talk later on about proper ways to interact with these species. So diet. So I mentioned, they live in these areas that, and they feed in areas with a lot of vegetation. They're herbivores, so they feed on low-growing vegetation, such as grasses, legumes, other herbaceous plants. They obtain most of their water actually from the plants they eat, so they rarely are seeking out, drinking areas or drinking pools, maybe only in a drought. But they're grazers, so they're out and about. This picture here, you'll see them just chomping away at that grass. And I listed a few, images of some of their favorites, or ones that they mow down on. That includes things like broadleaf grasses, wiregrass, blackberry, blueberry. So here in these pictures here, you have again a few of these species. The top left is dwarf huckleberry. The top right is butterfly pea. Bottom left is blueberry, and the bottom right is prickly pear cactus. So that's one you don't think of cactus in South Florida or in Florida in general, but this is a one that they are really keen to going after, and we find those in our coastal dune areas and our scrub habitats. They generally, in terms of where they go to feed, to forage, they generally feed within 160 feet of their burrow, their home. But they've been actually documented traveling more than twice the distance to meet their needs. So again, it depends on the availability and the range and what they can find in the immediate area. And again, that also helps them in terms of finding a suitable place for their burrow. So that's a little bit about what they eat. What about their behavior? And I include a little video on this just so you can get an idea of what they look like moving around. So again, you can see those big legs at work. And then this was in an area I took, or this video was taken, and there was a sign to kind of educate people about them and what that burrow looks like. So they are very sedentary. So they're, they'll move around again to forage, but a lot of times you'll see them basking in the sunlight, or they're in their burrows. And they're solitary. They don't live in big families or groups. They're solitary creatures. Of course, as a reptile, they're cold-blooded, ectothermic, meaning that they have to kind of warm up by going out in the sun. They are most active during April through October, so that's when you're going to see them out and about foraging. And again, that's the warmer months in a lot of the states that you find them in. So. But in South Florida, we don't get very our winters aren't cold, so they're active on warm days in the winter as well. Again, their home range varies with the habitat, the season, even the sex. but the males move around more frequently, and they have larger home ranges than the females do. So again, they're seeking their mates. So different studies have actually reported the annual average home ranges, so 1 to 114 acres for males and 0.2 to 14 acres for females. So keep that in mind for when we're talking about kind of range and their habitat and kind of, you know, what kind of habitat we have left here in South Florida. So I've been talking a lot about the burrows. What does that look like? So their home, whoops. So we're not talking about the hobbits and their holes. That we're talking about a burrow, and this burrow is actually built by this species. So they use their limbs to dig out. You can see their, you know, the front legs. They're using that to kind of dig out the sand, and they can dig these burrows. They're pretty deep. So one of the questions was, what is the average length? So how long is that burrow, or that tunnel? Basically, it's 15 feet long on average, and it can be down to about 6.5 feet deep. So they can get pretty far down into the sandy soil. And again, it's easier to kind of dig in that kind of soil. And the width is, again, just about the width of the tortoise, so it can move freely through that tunnel. They're usually easy to spot because you can see, again, if you can't see the hole, if it's covered by vegetation, there's this sandy apron or mound by the entrance. So that's all that discarded sand. And, you know, again, it's pretty much dug out by them moving in and out of the burrow. So the burrows, it depends how many they have throughout their lives, but it can, you know, it varies by individual. But they, you know, sometimes things happen to those burrows, or they need to find a better spot in terms of access to food or mates. So they can have multiple throughout their lifetimes. The burrows, they maintain a stable temperature and humidity year round. So they, you know, again, they're, especially here in South Florida, they're a little bit cooler, you know, underneath the ground there. And they provide that protection, obviously a shelter for extreme temperatures, fire, things like that. So in an event of a fire in their habitat, they can go into that burrow. And again, they'll when they forage, they're usually not moving too far away from that, especially, you know, with predators, things like that. So that burrow is important, and not just for them, it's important for a number of species. So Mikasa, Sukasa in this case, because the burrow, whether it's active or, you know, it's been abandoned, species, you know, for the same reason we just mentioned for the tortoise, it's suitable for them as well. So there's actually, you know, some important species that are known commensals. So that commensalism is, you know, they're sharing, they're not, you know, impacting each other negatively. They're kind of living there in harmony. So the burrowing owl is one that uses it. It's not pictured here, but is using it after the tortoise maybe has abandoned it. That's another Florida endemic species. We also have the Florida, the cottonmouse. We have the gopher frog. So it gets its name because it's most often found in these gopher tortoise burrows. The eastern indigo snake up here. And then just a number of invertebrates. You know, you can see a couple here, the scorpion, the scarab beetle, the gopher cricket. And then the eastern diamondback rattlesnake is another reptile that you can sometimes see in there. So these burrows are, you know, important. And so for the gopher tortoise, it's an ecosystem or ecosystem engineer. It's building something that is being used and changing the habitat, but providing habitat for other species. Kind of cool. So again, they're using these burrows too to nest. So they don't, this species doesn't reach sexual maturity until about 10 to 15 years of age. And they tend to mature a little bit faster in areas where those food sources are more abundant. But in any case, the breeding season, the males visit the females within the within a colony. So they're going around, they're the ones moving around trying to find that mate. Once they the females are impregnated and they're ready to lay their eggs, they dig at the mouth, at that sand apron. They'll dig a little a hole there right at the entrance. Sometimes they'll be out in the open, but you know, they usually try to bury them just a little bit below the sand. And the clutch sizes are usually 3 to 15 eggs. So not a huge clutch, not like sea turtles that are like 80 to 100. This is about 3 to 15. So again, important to remember when it comes to their conservation. The eggs take about 80 to 100 eggs, 180 to 100 eggs, excuse me, to incubate. And that depends on the temperature too. So similar to other reptiles, the temperature can determine the sex ratio. We use the mnemonic device hot chicks cool dudes in terms of, you know, how many females and males are in that nest. And something to think about when we talk about climate change, we're having warmer days, so, you know, higher temperatures, more high temperature days, so that means more chicks. So that can be a problematic in terms of the conservation of the species too. So the females, they usually have one successful clutch every 10 years. So that's not great. So it's really important in terms of providing habitat and making sure that, you know, the range for these species, you know, maintains or improves, because you know, we talked about the range and how much area those species need. It's like 1 to 114 acres for the males. So that's very important when we're talking about their success. And then of course, what do they look like when they hatch? They're cute little tortoises. So you'll see here one coming out, and they have a lighter color. You see they're kind of this like lighter yellow tan color. And that lasts for maybe a year and a half into the juvenile stage, and then they turn into that brown color that you saw with the adult. But they usually emerge during the months of August through November, so we're kind of getting into that season of hatching. And the tortoises, the moms, they don't exhibit any maternal care of the eggs or young, so they're pretty much on their own when they hatch out, and they have that instinct to you know, those certain instincts that help them along the way. So again, what are some threats at these different stages of their life cycle? What's really impacting them? Why are they a species that we're trying to get listed as an endangered species? Why are they protected in Florida? And really the biggest one is habitat loss, and that's through destruction, and that's mostly because we have built out a lot of these areas. You think about, where do we want to build here in specifically South Florida? And, you know, across the peninsula is on these higher ground, you know, this areas with higher ground. And of course, that's where these tortoises are, you know, endemic to. So, you know, the land clearing can be really problematic. They must, you know, it's the primary threat. But what happens with these developments, it can also fragment habitat. So even if we're leaving some areas for them, of course, we know their range and where they, you know, they need to move around. That fragmentation can be dangerous too. It can lead to, you know, them trying to cross roads. So vehicle strikes can be an issue. And then also degradation of habitat. So we talked about suppression of fire. We talked about, you know, some of the makeup of that habitat can change. So that can be a problematic, and that's again resulting from habitat destruction or degradation. There's other smaller threats. We can talk a little bit about disease. So there is a more recent one that has been impacting the populations. It's a respiratory tract disease, and it's research has been going into that to see how, you know, that's spreading in the population, but that's been leading to some decline. And then on a lesser scale, not mentioned here, but human harvest does happen in some places. Again, it's illegal. But that is something that has threatened them historically. But, you know, when it comes to their conservation and their protection, you know, there is permitting and laws in place to protect them, to move them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing on here is hydrological alterations. We mentioned that just because, again, you know, we're building canals through these areas that, again, are historically you know, higher ground, and so that can pose issues for them in terms of their range and their movement. So again, we talked about the threats and how we need to, you know, when it comes to the development being the major push for them in terms of their populations, there are permitting processes in place for these developments. So because they're protected in Florida in terms of handling and relocation, it's illegal unless it's conducted under a permit, and that's issued here in Florida by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And they have permitting guidelines. So here's just an example of a process review that it was in particular for Florida Department of Transportation that they have to go through in order to, before they go and develop or before they build a road, they have to assess the environment and are there gopher tortoises on that piece of property or in that area that they're going to develop. And so they have to be, in this case, that if they find them on these pieces of property, they have to be relocated before any clearing of land or development takes place. And so they have to obtain permits, and they have to, contract individuals that are experienced and permitted to assess and then relocate them. So a disturbance to these areas includes anything, basically any work within 25 feet of a gopher tortoise burrow. So most of these activities, again, are related to construction. When it comes to residential lawn or landscape maintenance, that's not included. But again, these more involved activities that could potentially collapse a burrow or harm the gopher tortoise. So again, the primary way that they're trying to save these species is to relocate these to areas that are safe. So they have to go through that permitting process, and then there's the relocation process as well. So early on in a lot of these projects, the project leads, they contract permitted individuals. These can be consulting agencies or local government to perform these qualitative assessments to determine if there are species living within the work site. So they usually do like a GPS mapping of any burrow locations, and then they overlay that on the project maps. And then that's how they figure out that 25-foot limit. So if a gopher tortoise relocation is in order, the trained permitted individuals, they'll be tasked with collecting the animals so that they can be identified and cataloged and then moved to that safe habitat that we'll talk about in terms of the sites, the recipient sites for these tortoises. So in many of the work sites, they do use heavy machinery. That they can sometimes use the backhoe to excavate the burrows and take the tortoises out. But in most cases, in other areas, especially more sensitive areas, more sensitive habitat, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, they seek to use less heavy equipment. So they'll use a more low-tech, high-efficiency method. So here's an example of it here, this photo. So basically what they do is they dig a small pit in front of the burrow with a 5-gallon bucket placed in it. Then they cover that with tinfoil and sand, and they put some sand in the bucket. And so when that tortoise comes out of its burrow, it falls into that bucket, and they monitor this, frequently, so that they make sure that as soon as it's captured, then they can remove it, and then they can, for the most part, they measure, they weigh, and a lot of the times they tag them before they relocate. So where do they take these tortoises? So these recipient sites, they're important because they help to restore and they maintain these gopher tortoise populations throughout the range, and they prevent that loss of tortoise from development. Again, it's not a endangered species, so that work won't stop. It's just they will remove it and move it to a site that it's safe. It maintains that local or regional tortoise population. So for the most part, a lot of these relocation sites are very close, are nearby, is what they seek to do in most situations. And they preserve that habitat that they're used to, and that the other species that depend on their burrows. So the restocking of those tortoises is managed to manage lands with reduced populations, and they assist in research efforts. So again, they measure and they are able to assess the population when they move these tortoises. And some of these protected areas are used for relocations, but really it's private and public landowners that play a key role in conserving and restoring these gopher tortoise populations. And they receive permits. They get designated as a recipient site. And so they receive that permit that designates their land as a gopher tortoise safe haven, a habitat. So this happens all across the state. And, it helps to, maintain that habitat. And we have these locations that, again, they're a lot of times they're conservation easements as well. So they are looking to keep that land in that state to provide the best habitat possible. Of course, do we all wish that there could be less development and we're not disturbing these animals? Yes, but this is the best method to maintain those populations. So in terms of conservation, besides these relocation processes, what are keys to the gopher tortoise's conservation? So the gopher tortoise, as we mentioned, is a keystone species, meaning it's important for other species in its environment, and it's important as a indicator for the habitat and the health of that habitat. And it really won't survive unless there's strong advocates out there for its conservation efforts, like to push for its listing on the federally the endangered species list, and then some of these processes and actions and permitting individuals and individuals here across the state. Again, many wildlife agencies work to promote that habitat conservation. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the state park system, and then local governments too. They work to maintain that habitat and purchase and protect that habitat. And then they manage that land as well. So we're talking about when possible, implementing fire, bringing fire back to those places where it's possible. And again, that maintains that habitat and for the gopher tortoise and the species that rely on it. And it's essential to really preserve these areas that are upland, but also the wetland areas, because that's a whole ecosystem. It's not just these upland areas. These tortoises rely, and the other species in its environment rely on other adjoining areas, including wetland areas. So that's important to remember as well. And so what are some conservation efforts actually underway with those things in mind? So we have some different studies happening across the state. I mentioned a few briefly here. So we have some mark and recapture studies. So that's when they're going out and assessing these populations by documenting burrows, documenting individuals. And related to that, there's also nesting and hatchling success studies. So looking at, how are these populations doing in terms of their, nesting. We're looking where we talked about the species and the sex ratios. So, and talking about climate change in that regard, and getting that complete picture of the nesting and success rates for this species. We just talked about habitat conservation and management, super important. We didn't talk too much, but removing exotic species is key. So here in Miami-Dade County, we have our environmentally endangered lands program, working with our natural areas management teams to maintain these habitats. That's just an example here in Miami-Dade County. And they actively are working to remove these exotic species, planting native vegetation where possible, and researching and managing those lands so that we can, again, maintain these pieces that are critical, especially in a place like Miami-Dade County, for these charismatic and other species. And then, of course, research and education is always key when it comes to, these kinds of efforts. We want to educate, provide outreach activities to all the communities that not just, maybe live in areas that gopher tortoises also live in, but just to be aware of issues related to tortoise conservation. Again, there's a myriad of threats that aren't just related to tortoises on your piece of property. And that also, research and education also, involves providing information to politicians, to land managers, to developers, and other decision makers that have some say, other stakeholders that have some say in these lands and these species. And I listed down here just a few agencies. I have some references later in the presentation that talk about, or that work on gopher tortoise conservation. Of course, we talked about the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They're the ones that are the permitting agency and in terms of protection. And then we have nonprofits, we have university partners. We talked about the landowners and how key they are. So it's a a concerted effort across the board. So lastly, let's talk about ways that you can help this species. So I have a few slides here that list a lot of the different ways that you can help gopher tortoises, whether they live on your property or you live in their range, or again, even if you don't. So here, this first slide, we have Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has a tortoise sighting application, a web app. So you can be a citizen scientist, and when you're out, if you're hiking or in a park, you can report your sighting, and this helps again with population assessments, and of course we want to report them if they look injured or they're in trouble. Of course, we don't want to intervene. We want to contact the FWC, and I have that on the next slide. But with this one, you can report their location. You can also report the location of their burrows. And then if you go to this link here, it's really easy, myfwc.com/gopher tortoise. That's where you can enter that information as well. You can see it on any platform really, on a phone or on a desktop. And then you can submit photos through that. And then you can also look at, they have an interactive map there too, which is kind of cool to look at to see where those tortoise sightings have been across the state. So that's one cool citizen science way to get involved. And then we have, of course, as we talked about, we want to give gopher tortoises some space. I found this image I saw the other day when NASA posted it, but this gopher tortoise, again, they're on areas just along the coast, like Kennedy Space Center. But yeah, we want to give them their space. So again, it's against the law to kill, harass, or destroy gopher tortoises or their burrows and their eggs. So if you see any illegal activity, you can report it. Or again, if you see one in distress, please report them to the hotline. Sometimes they'll let you know to, let's say it's crossing a road, they'll give you the appropriate information as to how to bring it to a safe location. So that's the phone number there. You can always just go on Google and search FWC's Wildlife Alert Hotline. That number will pop up. And then there's also, you can text as well. So that's a good thing to remember. And then be a gopher tortoise advocate in your community. So let elected officials know you care about preserving Florida's native wildlife, including gopher tortoises. You can encourage, again, write to your local and state officials to set aside that habitat for them. You can be active and when there's areas threatening development or you have public property that might be considered for development. You can be active in protesting that. You can advocate for green spaces. So, combining greenways and different parks and management areas across the state and across your community. We want to build these corridors, these wildlife tunnels around these areas of development so that they can safely make their way across their range. And then if you live in an area that's actually designated as gopher tortoise habitat, or you have that habitat on your property, you can do a few things to kind of help with that. You can kind of manage your property that way. So keeping if there actually are burrows, keep those entrances clear. They have these signs available with FWC. You can post the sign in your yard. Pretty cute. And then you can provide gopher tortoise friendly landscaping too. So you can add some of their plant diet, so you can blend those in with your landscaping. Again, these are Florida native species, so they're low maintenance and adapted to the Florida climate and environment. So that's one good way, and also that benefits pollinators too, not just our gopher tortoise species. And then help your friends and neighbors learn about gopher tortoises and again all the other animals and plants that they help support. And then this is something new. So there's been a flurry of new license plates kind of going out there. And this was one actually put out there by the Florida Wildlands Conservation, to help support different conservation initiatives. So there's a gopher tortoise license plate bill that was signed into law by the governor this year. I don't think like the other plates, there has to be 300, I think, signatures or not purchases of a voucher, 3,000 vouchers purchased to make it official as a license plate that they're going to print. So hopefully those will be on sale soon. Enough people are interested. I think that's great artwork. It represents the tortoise, their burrow, and the habitat really well. And then funds from that license plate, hopefully that would be distributed through eligible, Florida-based scientific, conservation, education organizations. So that's really cool. You can find out more at wildlandsconservation.org regarding that voucher sale. And let's see. So that takes us to our poll. So we're going to test your knowledge. And we also have a fourth question here. So Anna, thank you for launching that. So again, I'll read out the question. So what is the average lifespan of a gopher tortoise in the wild? Is it 10 to 30 years, 20 to 40 years, 30 to 50 years, or 40 to 60 years? The second question, true or false? Again, the gopher tortoise is federally listed as threatened across its entire range. True or false? And then 3, on average, a gopher tortoise burrow is how many feet in length? 5, 10, 15, or 20? And then just a question that helps us out, if you can answer, do you intend to apply or share the information that you've learned today beyond this presentation? So we'll give you a few seconds to answer that. And again, if you're done filling that out, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type those in. I'd be happy to answer anything that came up in a couple slides here.
All right, thank you, Ed. I'm going to leave that poll open for another couple of minutes. And it's just after 6:45, so thank you for joining us. If you have to leave, no problem. We are going to stay online for a little while longer to take questions with Ed.